All right, so let's move on to the next panel. The goal of the next panel is to put this drought, both the last year and a half and the last 2 decades, into the context of the broader climate. We will first hear from Andy Hoell and Isla Simpson. Andy is a research meteorologist at the NOAA Physical Sciences Laboratory and co-leads the NOAA Drought Task Force. Isla Simpson is a research scientist in the Climate and Global Dynamics Laboratory at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, or NCAR. Following Isla, we will learn about aridification from Erica Fleishman. Erica is the director of the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute and is a professor at Oregon State University. So with those introductions, I turn it over to you, Andy.
Yeah, thank you, Isla. And thank you to the prior speakers. That was a really nice discussion. So as part of setting the stage, the NOAA Drought Task Force is here today to present on conditions that led to the 2020 to 2021 drought and what the future may hold for drought in the Southwest United States. Our presentation today is based on a more comprehensive report on the ongoing drought, and the report may be found on drought.gov and on NOAA Climate Program Office websites. The NOAA Drought Task Force is led by myself, Andy Hoyle, Isla Simpson, who will also present today, and Justin Mankin, who led a report on the drought, and also Rong Fu. Our contact information can be found on the slide. The NOAA Drought Task Force is made up of approximately 50 scientists representing federal, academic, and private institutions that are funded to perform various aspects of drought research by NIDIS and the NOAA Climate Program Office's Modeling, Analysis, Predictions, and Projection Program. Members of the Drought Task Force collaborate on joint projects, one of which you'll learn about today on the ongoing Southwest U.S. drought. We're thankful for our ongoing collaboration and the support of NIDIS. Moving on to the next slide, we illustrate the severity of the ongoing Southwest U.S. drought from time series of naturalized flows of the Colorado River at Lee's Ferry in Arizona. The time series is for January to December, or calendar year in million acre feet. The colors indicate the percentile rank of calendar year flows, where browner colors indicate increasingly lower flows. The fourth lowest flow in the historical record since 1906 was observed in 2021, and this was on the heels of low flow in 2020. For the last 20 years, Lee's Ferry naturalized flows were also low in the historical record, with 4 years in the low 10 percentile of the historical distribution. Moving on to the next slide, we show the 4 questions that were considered in a report on the 2020 to 2021 Southwest U.S. drought. How bad is it? How did it evolve? When will it end? And what does the future hold? So for brevity, we will only discuss aspects related to how bad is it and what does the future hold. I'll present on how bad is it, and Isla will present on what our future holds. So moving on to the next slide, we begin our assessment of conditions that led to the severity of the drought by showing precipitation for January to August of the following year. On the left is precipitation percentiles for that 20-month period over the contiguous U.S. for January 2020 to August 2021. The Southwest U.S. states, California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, and Colorado are highlighted. On the right is time series of 20-month precipitation over the Southwest United States, with the colors indicating the percentile rank of precipitation. Again, like the previous time series, browner colors mean lower precipitation. Profound and widespread dryness was observed across the Southwest United States, with many areas experiencing their lowest such 20-month stretch. And those areas that did not receive their lowest precipitation were among the lowest on record. The profound dryness was caused by consecutive failed rainy seasons, notably winters in 2020 and 2021, and the failed monsoon in 2020, which led to by far record low precipitation over the 4 corner states during June to September of 2020. For the regional average on the right, January 2020 to August 2021 experienced by far the lowest precipitation on record. No other 20-month stretch since 1895 rivaled 2020 and 2021. You can see there that there are about 6 years that were among the lowest, and they rivaled one another, but they paled in comparison to 2020. The exceptional dryness in the last 20 months punctuates 2 decades of low precipitation. However, it's still important to note that decades of low precipitation have been observed over the Southwest United States. Examples include the 1920s and 1970s, though this 20-year stretch is a little bit longer than the ones that we'd seen prior. Moving on to the next slide, we illustrate here the warmth during the 20-month period spanning January 2020 to August 2021. The left panel shows temperature percentile ranks, which indicates widespread warmth across the Southwest United States that fell into the upper 5 percentile of the historical record since 1895. The right panel shows a time series of regional average temperature for 20-month periods beginning in January. And again, the color scale is similar to what we showed in prior time series, where bluer colors indicate cooler temperatures relative to a historical record, and warmer colors, warmer temperatures relative to the historical record. January 2020 to August 2021 was the third warmest stretch in our instrumental record. This 20-month period caps off what was by far the warmest decade we have experienced in the Southwest United States. Note that the warmth in the last decade continued the warming trend in the Southwest United States that began in the early 1980s. So we'll now tackle the question of what the future holds for the Southwest US, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, Isla.
Thanks. So yeah, I'll try and address the question of what role has greenhouse gas-driven climate change played in what we've seen, first of all, in the shorter term, in 2020 in particular, and then also in the last couple of decades of aridification that we've seen. And then what should we be expecting moving forward for the coming decades? So if you go to the next slide. So the tool I'll use here will be Earth system models. So these are global, fully coupled numerical models of the Earth system. So they're simulating the historical climate and then projecting future climate change. And they're given forcers such as greenhouse gas emissions and aerosols and other natural and anthropogenic forcings. And we'll use 33 different models that are developed from modeling centers from all around the world. And these are the simulations that contributed to the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. So next slide. So we'll focus on area averages over the 6 states in the US Southwest, and I'll show 2 quantities: precipitation, which doesn't really need more explanation, and then vapor pressure deficit, which might be less familiar. So next slide. So just to explain a bit more what VPD means, is basically the atmosphere's thirst for water. So it's the difference between how much water vapor the atmosphere is capable of holding and how much it has. And how much water vapor the atmosphere is capable of holding, that depends on temperature. So this is where you might expect that greenhouse gas driven warming might play an important role in what we're seeing. And so basically, if you have a higher vapor pressure deficit, then if you have moisture available, you're going to see more evaporation, more drying out of the land surface and evaporation from reservoirs and so on. So next slide. So it's important to just keep in mind that precipitation and VPD are kind of interconnected. If you have a year with higher precipitation, you'll likely have a lower VPD, and that's because a year with higher precipitation, the atmosphere will have more water vapor and it will likely also be cooler. But then also both of these quantities can be affected just by natural internal variability in the system, and they can also be influenced by anthropogenic climate change. And so trying to pull out the climate change part of this is what we're going to do here. So if you go to the next slide. So I'm going to walk you through this figure, which is showing precipitation on the horizontal and then vapor pressure deficit in the vertical. And the dots here that you see are the observed anomalies for the 1950 to 2000 period. And these are anomalies from the average of that period. And the dots, they're color coded based on the year. So we're going from the 1950s in the dark blue to the 90s in the lighter blue. And so you see here this relationship between VPD and precipitation. And if you go to the next slide, what you see here in the contours, this is what we get from our Earth system model. So this is the joint probability distribution of precipitation of VPD as simulated by the models. So basically, the contours are showing how likely is it that you'll have a year which has this kind of joint value of precipitation and VPD, with the darker colors being more likely. And so you see that our observed years, they sit pretty nicely within this model distribution, and so that gives us some confidence in the behavior of the models. But this is just up to the year 2000 at this point. So if we go to the next slide, the dots here, now we're going into those yellow and orange colors, and this is showing the observed values for the last 2 decades. And so what you see is there's not really a clear trend in precipitation, but there's a very clear trend in vapor pressure deficit. These dots are moving up towards a higher VPD, and then you see 2020 there off on its own. It's pretty extreme in terms of having both low precipitation and higher vapor pressure deficit. And so these dots in the last couple of decades have really moved outside of the distribution that we get from the models in the pre-2000 climate. So if we go to the next slide, we can ask the question of the models, if we were in the pre-2000 climate, so from 1950 to 2000, what would be the chances that we'd have a year like 2020 in both precipitation and then in vapor pressure deficit? And so the models suggest that having a year like 2020 with as low precipitation as what we've seen, there's about a 2% chance of that happening. So a 1 in 50 year kind of event, which is somewhat consistent with our observational record. But when you look at VPD, none of the years of the almost 2,000 years of simulation that are going into that blue cloud there exhibits VPD as high as what we got in 2020. It was basically impossible in the pre-2000 climate, according to the models. But of course, since the year 2000, we've had anthropogenic warming. And so if we go to the next slide, what you see in this orange cloud here is now the model's probability distribution centered on 2020. So this is for the years 2010 to 2030. And you can see that the model distribution has shifted up towards higher vapor pressure deficits, which is very aligned with what we've seen in the observations. And now if we ask that same question, what's the chance of having a year like 2020? For precipitation, it hasn't really changed. There's not been an increase in the probability of having a year as low as 2020 for precipitation. But for VPD, it has changed. It's gone from being basically impossible in the pre-2000 climate, according to the models, to now being possible. It's still extreme. There's still only a 0.4% chance that you'd have a year like 2020, but it has now become possible. And that's because we really shifted towards higher vapor pressure deficits because of anthropogenic warming. And so if you go to the next slide, what we're showing here now in this kind of purple blob is the model's projections for the coming decades for the 2030 to 2050 period. And so again, we don't really see a clear systematic change in precipitation. The likelihood of having a year like 2020 is not systematically increasing or decreasing over time. But for VPD, it's a very different story. And there's a clear systematic increase in vapor pressure deficit simulated by the models. And they suggest that a year like what we've had in 2020, by the time we're at kind of 2030 to 2050, it will be a 1 in 10 year kind of event. So the model suggests anthropogenic climate change is not really changing the likelihood of having a precipitation event like 2020, but it is definitely changing the likelihood of having vapor pressure deficit like what we saw in 2020. So next slide. So I just want to finish up by addressing kind of longer time scales, because we've also had this longer term aridification. And so here I'm just showing the same figure, but for decadal means. And these are rolling decadal means over the period. And so this is our 1950 to 2000 period for decadal averages. And if we go to the next slide, this is now showing how the real world has evolved up to the last decade and how our models think things should be evolving under anthropogenic climate change. And so if we ask the same questions of what's the chances of having a decade like the ones that we've just seen based on our models. For precipitation, again, there's no clear systematic change in the likelihood of having a decade with as low precipitation as what we've seen in the last decade. But for vapor pressure deficit, there's definitely a clear systematic change. And our models suggest that a decade like the one we've just seen basically just wouldn't have happened in a pre-2000 climate for VPD. There's now about a 7% chance of having a decade like the one we've just seen. And moving forward by 2030 to 2050, the models suggest that a decade like the one we've just seen for vapor pressure deficit would be kind of a normal decade. So if you go to the next slide, Just finish up with the key takeaways here. So kind of for the nearer term drought that we've just experienced, as Andy went through, 2020 to 21 was extreme. The precipitation deficits were the lowest on record, but our models indicate that climate change did not really make these precipitation deficits more likely. The vapor pressure deficits were the highest on record, and climate change almost certainly contributed to this. The warming that occurred since the late 20th century has really made it possible to have VPD this high. But even if you account for climate change, 2020 was still a very extreme year. Looking to the future, we have no indications that climate change will drive annual mean precipitation declines over the Southwest as a whole, but I do want to point out that there's quite a lot of complexity if you start to dig deeper and wonder about seasonal variations or more local spatial variations within the region. And we should be prepared for continued increases in vapor pressure deficit due to warming. And by 2030 to 2050, we should expect about 1 in 10 years to have VPD as high as 2020. And that a normal decade will look like 2011 to 2020 in vapor pressure deficit. So that's pretty much all I have. And just if you go to the next slide, I do just want to point out that there are many open questions and other things that we still need to understand about this drought and about longer term aridification and our future projected changes, but that's basically kind of what we presented is our understanding at this point. So thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Isla and Andy. Whoops, turn my camera back on. All right, well, again, I will remind attendees that if you have questions, please start putting them into the questions box. We already have a couple I see, and we will have a Q&A after Erica's presentation. Looks like we will have a lot of good information to continue to dialogue with these panelists. So next up is Erica. Erica? I think you're muted. I cannot hear you. I see you, but I can't hear you.
How's that?
There you go. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, our presentations are going to dovetail really nicely. You may even think it was done by design. So please, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here talking with all of you. Next slide, please. I want to recognize the people that have been working on what I'm going to be sharing with you today. It's a terrific group of people, and we've been doing this work under the auspices of the Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. Next slide, please. So as has just been reviewed, mean temperature in the Southwest has been increasing in recent decades and is projected to continue increasing quite a bit, regardless of realistic emission scenarios. Next, please. So coincident with that, it's not just means, it's extremes that are increasing. And next slide, please. Temperatures are increasing throughout the year, and summer, in a relative sense, summer is increasing more than some other seasons. Depends exactly where you are, but we're looking at increases in means, and we're looking at increases in extremes. Next slide, please. So a region that is known for being hot and dry is becoming hotter and drier. And one of those manifestations, next slide, please, is drought. So there are a lot of different ways of defining drought. The most basic way to define drought is simply insufficient water to meet needs. And that's a definition that many of you may have known Kelly Redmond, that he just said, you know, it's simply not having enough water. But there are a lot of different ways to quantify not having enough water. And I want to briefly mention two metrics to keep in mind. So next slide, please. So if you think about basic biology, one way to look at water is sort of atmospheric thirst. And think about evaporation, evapotranspiration. So think about all of the ways in which water is converted to water vapor, or ice is converted to water vapor. So so plants respiring, evaporation, direct sublimation of snow and ice. And there are ways of kind of standardizing measurements or estimates for models, but this can be pretty tricky to measure. All measures of drought, really a lot of biological variables, can be pretty difficult to measure. So, so one way to look at dryness is atmospheric. And next slide, please. Another way to look at it is soil moisture. And soil moisture turns out to be pretty tricky. There are soil moisture often is measured over large areas through remote sensing. And it turns out there can be a lot of challenges in that. Soil moisture also can be measured at different depths. But so for the purposes of this, just keep in mind you can have atmospheric water and you can have soil water. And both of these are used often to try to estimate how dry things are and how dry things may be in the future. Next slide, please. So as was just mentioned, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is looking at many things that are changing as a result of greenhouse gas emissions. And one of those is soil moisture. And so the IPCC's most recent report refers to agricultural drought and ecological drought. We'll get into that a little bit in a second. But how they are measuring those types of drought amounts to soil moisture deficit. And what this is illustrating, this is a representation of the world as hexagons. Focus on WNA over there in the upper left. So that's Western North America. And there's high confidence that soil moisture deficit is increasing in Western North America, and medium confidence that much of that is attributable to anthropogenic climate change. So this is fairly well established. Next slide, please. And also, as was just discussed, it is likely that that these deficits that we've been having, if you want to think of it just in terms of that, severe droughts are going to increase in frequency and increase in magnitude throughout the Southwest and really the entire Western United States in the coming decades. Next slide, please. So lots and lots of different ways of thinking about drought. And some of them are, in a sense, fairly easy to measure. I mean, they are, or they're more objectively measured. So meteorological drought is pretty straightforward to measure. Hydrological drought is pretty somewhat straightforward to measure. But there are a lot of types of drought that are kind of open to interpretation in terms of what does drought mean. Next slide, please. We really see this as we get into ecological. So ecological drought, for example, has been thought of as sort of the point at which there are thresholds in ecosystem resilience or something like that. And they are great concepts, but they can be pretty difficult to quantify, to say, what does this mean to a particular species of plant, whether it's cultivated or whether it's wild? What does this mean to a particular animal, especially when animals can move? What does this mean to a process? So lots and lots of different ways of looking at drought, lots of ways to measure it, lots of ways to interpret what it means to humans and to natural systems. So next slide, please. Okay, so so again, summing up, a lot of effects of aridity. I'm going to be talking about aridity for a bit, the inverse of water availability, and lots of mechanisms. So how do we kind of get into that? Next slide, please. So thinking about, what contributes to aridity, we tend to think about precipitation. I mean, I think for many of us, we think that if there's drought, it means that it hasn't been raining and snowing much. And that in part is true, but next slide, please. Although this has been a very dry period over much of the Southwest, aside from the monsoon this past summer, it's been a really dry period for quite a while across the West and the Southwest. Next slide, please. Precipitation over the water year in the Southwest has actually been fairly stable and is projected to increase. Precipitation across the region is projected to either stay fairly stable or even increase a little bit in the coming decades, even given the various scenarios of anthropogenic climate change. Next slide, please. And that is true during all seasons across the region as a whole. And it's somewhat variable. If you get up into the Northwest, summers are projected to become drier and winters wetter. But if you look at these regions as a whole, there's some averaging. So basically, precipitation is projected to be stable. So what else is going on? Next slide, please. Other contributors to aridity besides precipitation. Next slide. We're all pretty familiar with the fact that for a given amount of water, if the temperature is higher, that water is likely to become less available more rapidly. So next slide. So basically, for a given amount of water, as it becomes hotter, water use by plants, one form of water use is likely to, plants are likely to need more water as it becomes hotter. And so this means that water is less available, even though the amount of water that falls from the sky may not change that much. So next slide. This becomes pretty interesting. So again, transpiration's increasing. Something that has not been addressed that much, it's pretty difficult at this point, but it's being observed in small areas and is a conceptual possibility, is that in some cases, some plants may become more efficient users of, as carbon dioxide increases, they may be able to use water more efficiently. So there may be some offset in drought stress, but that's not likely to be everywhere, and it's not likely to be all the time. But it's kind of an interesting conceptual twist in all of this, and gets to the notion that that plants and animals are pretty adaptable if given half a chance. So next slide, please. Some of the other contributors, so we have water being one contributor, precipitation, we have temperature being a contributor, also wind speed, solar radiation, and humidity. All of these contribute to overall aridity, or basically to water limitation. And which of these contributors is dominant in a particular place and time actually matters quite a bit to agricultural systems and to ecological systems. Next slide, please. So for example, butterflies are quite sensitive to overall water limitation, in part because they depend on plants for food as caterpillars and for food as adults, at least for the species that take nectar from flowers. But they're also really sensitive to solar radiation because they're cold-blooded and they need to warm up in order to be able to fly and to find mates and to feed. So for that animal, it's not just overall water limitation, it's also the driver. It's the driver of solar radiation. And there are other cultivated or wild species that are more or less sensitive to those different drivers of aridity. So in part, what is driving aridity in a particular place and time really matters, in addition to the overall metric of aridity itself. Next slide, please. This is hard stuff to figure out, and so it's fantastic that computing capacity is increasing and that a lot of statistical methods are evolving and in many ways improving over time. But it's really hard to tease all of this apart, both conceptually and numerically. So next slide, please. So what this group of us that I mentioned at the start is trying to do, this is very much work in progress, is we're trying to look at past and future ecologically available water. And remember those metrics. So we're looking at it in terms of atmospheric values, various measures of evaporation, atmospheric vapor pressure deficit, things like that. We're also looking at it in terms of soil measures. And we're trying to decompose those estimates of water availability into all of those drivers that I mentioned. So into wind, temperature, solar radiation, and humidity. And looking at that in how it varies in seasons and in regions. First in the past to try to get a good explanatory model, and then hopefully in the future projecting how this may change in the future and what this means for different organisms. Next slide, please. Next, please. Great, thank you. So the way that we are looking at this, for those of you that are thinking about all of the data sets, for the past observations, we're looking at the ERI5 reanalysis. It's taken a lot of time to zoom in on, or to zero in on what the best sources of data for these analyses are likely to be. Projections, if downscale projections from CMIP6 are available by the time we get into this in earnest, we'll use CMIP6. Otherwise, we'll be using CMIP5. Across the West, moderate spatial resolution, we probably can go to finer resolution locally. There are some emerging downscales that are as small as 2 to 6 kilometers, but probably not across the entire region. And we are fairly confident that we can get a temporal extent that starts in 1980 and goes up to 2100. We may be able to go back to 1950, but we're not entirely sure about that just yet. So just some examples what this looks like when you decompose. Next slide, please. So this is an example that Mike Hobbins has worked up. This is not the West Coast, but it's a good example nevertheless. So basically think of this, I'm going to oversimplify a little bit. This is overall water limitation over a 2-month period last summer. Next slide, please. If you decompose that overall measure of aridity into various drivers, so what you can see here, temperature, humidity, radiation, and wind speed, just look at the differences in the colors. So, so there was not, certain things were driving this more than others. And temperature in this case was a greater driver than a change in humidity or in radiation or wind. So different of those contributors have different effects, but keep in mind, again, in different time periods and in different places. So next slide. Another example from a different place, same thing here, but in this case, temperature in the northern Great Plains, going with the same, sorry about not having labels on there, not quite the same here. So in this case, wind, which is in the lower right, was a major contributor in addition to temperature. And humidity, again, not as much of a contributor, but different things going on in different time periods and in different places. Next, please. So what we are planning to do here is also to be able to make these data inputs and data outputs easy to visualize and to download, most likely working through the Climate Toolbox, which is led by John Abatzoglu. So we hope to be able to have data layers that users can pretty easily download or download the data behind them. The data are available, but they can be a pain to extract without a lot of computing power. And also to examine how these measures of aridity and how the different contributions of different drivers in space and time affect different types of plants and animals. So next slide, please.
Pardon the interruption, Erica. You have 3 minutes left.
Yep, this is about it. So again, plants and animals are adaptable. Their responses to climate can change over time, can evolve. However, we think that those case studies will be useful in terms of illustrating to users what they might be able to do with these input and output data layers. And last slide, please. Thank you again. That's all I have, and looking forward to talking with you further.
Great, thank you so much, Erica. All right, at this time, I'm going to invite Andy and Isla to turn your cameras back on and unmute yourselves for a Q&A session. We do have some questions that came in. I would just like to, again, invite folks to, if you have a question, to type it into the questions box, and we can go ahead and get that question out to the panelists. We are going to be ending the Q&A session at 12:40 Eastern Daylight Time, so just to do a time check with everybody. So let's go ahead and get to some of the questions here. I'm going to start with a question from Tony Willardson, who is with the Western States Water Council. Tony asks, what, if any, conclusions can be drawn from comparisons between recent recorded droughts with anthropogenic impacts and decadal droughts from the paleo record, pre-industrialization, and assuming a lack of impacts from human-related emissions?
Andy, do you want? I guess I could. I think. Well, the last couple of decades are now drier than any droughts that have been seen in the paleo record. I think there was a recent study by Park Williams that went up to 2018, and at that point there was one that was kind of comparable in the 1500s or something. But I think now, if you include the couple of years that have happened since then, it's now drier than any in the paleo record. I think it's pretty clear that for vapor pressure deficit, like, we are on a trend that is being anthropogenically forced and pushing us kind of outside of natural variability. And like we saw in both talks, I guess precipitation, it's less clear that there's any kind of forced trends in that.
Yeah,
Erica, oh, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead, Andy.
yeah, this is a research topic, but we can take the last 20 months as I showed before. You know, that happened in a very warm climate. And there were some droughts that happened in the 30s and 40s where precipitation wasn't quite as low, but temperatures were much, much lower, to the degree that we can actually use that information to be able to parse out, you know, what are the effects on land surface conditions using our historical record to build up a little bit more robust line of evidence. That's something that we can do, and hopefully we can take on.
Erica, did you want to add anything to this? Okay, all right. All right, let's move on to the next question. The next question is from Stephanie Conley, and she's asking, are there models that can link VPD to ecological factors and predictions of desertification in the US, especially with post-fire on the landscape?
Yeah, I think there's definitely been a lot of advances in the representation of the land surface, and things are getting there. And there are now like, dynamic vegetation models where fire can interact with vegetation, but I guess it's still kind of somewhat early stages for that. And I think many of the models that I showed don't have that degree of complexity quite yet, but it's getting there, and there are models that can start to simulate that. And in our model, we have a representation of fires. They don't feed back with their emissions yet, but that it's getting there.
There's also a lot of work tying, or maybe not a lot of work, but some fairly recent and very high quality work tying vapor pressure deficit to fire likelihood. So I mean, fire becomes complicated because you have to have dry vegetation, which in fire world often is called fuels. You also need to have high wind generally to spread a fire, and you need a spark. And often in the West, the sparks are the product of human infrastructure or human oopses. So that vapor pressure deficit isn't the only factor, but there is quite a bit of work tying vapor pressure deficit to increase likelihood of fires and to increase likelihood of large fires.
Okay. We have a question. Let's see here. I believe this is for all. For the annual means, actually this might be for, well, I'll just pose it to all of you. For the annual means vapor pressure deficit anomalies, are those global or for the 6 states? And if it's for the 6 states, which 6 states were used?
So I think this was probably to me, sorry if I didn't make that clear. That was the 6 states in the southwest of the US. So Colorado, Utah, Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona, and California.
Great, okay. We also have another question here for you, Erica. Surface solar radiation has been increasing over the southern part of the Southwest. Should we consider surface solar radiation as one drought indicator for its impact on ecosystem and wildlife in addition to surface temperature?
It is some forms of radiation, and I am not an expert on all of the different measures of radiation. Some forms of radiation, again, are contributors along with temperature and wind and humidity and precipitation to overall measures of aridity. So it's one thing. I wouldn't rely on any one thing as the indicator, or saying that as solar radiation increases, it means anything that is applicable to all plants and all animals or something like that. It's an additional thing to keep in the mix. And for some types of cultivated and wild plants and animals, it's going to be a greater contributor because of their biology than, or it's going to be a greater factor than something else. But it's really hard to generalize in a meaningful way about what these different contributors to aridification mean to different organisms.
Thank you. Another question that's just come in, is there evidence that the seasonal temperature differences in western coastal region versus more inland regions influencing the speed of the Santa Ana winds, or is it that it's a very rare occurrence?
Well, I'll just come out and say I don't know the answer to the question, but I do know there's some fire projects in that area that focus on it specifically. And I would refer the person who asked the question to them, because I know that's ongoing, and they have a lot to offer.
My understanding from colleagues at Scripps who work on Santa Ana winds is that there's not a clear indication of whether those wind patterns are likely to change. There's work ongoing, as Andy said, but winds are really difficult to project. And right now, there's not a strong indication that wind patterns that tend to drive fires across the West are likely to change as a cause of anthropogenic climate, or as a consequence of anthropogenic climate change.
Thank you. I'm going to take this opportunity to invite the panelists as well to ask each other questions as well. But I'd like to take this opportunity as the moderator to ask a question, and maybe this is going into a part of the work, Andy and Isla, that you did that you weren't able to talk about, but and hopefully I can phrase this correctly as a layperson, but you know, we keep using the term, you have been using the term aridification, and aridification has the connotation with it is that it's permanent, right? As opposed to a drought, which is an extreme event, which implies that there is an end point. So I guess how are you reconciling the use of the word aridity with this idea, Isla and Andy, that you put in the report, which I would recommend everybody checking the chat box because we provided you a link to the report, when you tried to answer the question, when is it going to end?
So I don't know, Andy, do you want to go first, or?
Why don't you go first?
Well, I guess I have the question that I have is really kind of what's the relative role of the precipitation versus the vapor pressure deficit, like quantitatively in what we're seeing, because we have seen kind of natural declines in precipitation. I think we expect that would probably end. But we've also got this increasing temperature, which presumably is increasing the evaporation from the soils. And that's kind of what I would think of as aridification. And that I don't think we're expecting to end. But I don't think we have, at least I don't have a very good handle on like the relative importance of those two things in kind of soil moisture evolution over the last couple of decades in the real world. We can look at our models and try and quantify it, but of course our models are not perfect. So yeah, I guess I divide it up into kind of the temperature impacts and the precipitation impacts, which are coupled together. But on top of that, there's the anthropogenic forcing, which is clearly making it warmer.
Yeah, I just want to add on a little bit to that. Aridification has a connotation that it's a secular trend and there will be no recovery, whereas drought does have a recovery, like you said, Viva. So it's just completely cyclical. It depends on the baseline that you look at, and that's sector specific. So if you're used to water demand, say, based on a baseline of like 1950 to 2000, perhaps that's something that you can use. But really in the science community, we're not very good at separating this right now. We're using projections of climate models like, 50 years from now and saying, well, drought 50 years from now compared to a climate of like 50 years in the past, it'll be so much more prevalent. But that may not be the right question there because that may be part of an aridification component or a secular trend that has no recovery. So I think with the science community, there needs to be a little bit more of an interaction with the stakeholder community about how we characterize these things and what this means for stakeholder-based and informative science. So it's a great question. It's something that we bat around a lot, and I don't think that the science community nor the stakeholder community has all the answers for that right now.
Fair enough. Okay, Erica, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, if you think about it in a pretty general sense, I mean, kind of following up on what Isla and Andy said, there are different parts of the Southwest that are more or less arid, if you want to think about it in a baseline sense. So the Sonoran Desert is drier than areas further to the north, and plants and animals have adapted to that level of overall aridity. You can still have a drought in an arid place. You can still have a high water year in an arid place, and so that's kind of superimposed on overall aridity. And so if you have a long-term trend of aridification, in theory, plants and animals can adapt to that. there are still going to be periods of extremes, of extreme water limitation, even in an arid system, or of water abundance in an arid system. So you can kind of think of it as kind of an overall characteristic of an area versus something that's generally thought of as more temporary, as others have said.
Great. Well, thank you. I want to say thank you again to the panelists. This has been a very great last several minutes spending time with you. We appreciate the presentations.